Good evening once again. We begin in Cuba, where in a historic ceremony, the United States has raised its flag over its embassy in the capital of Havana. The official opening of the embassy comes after more than 50 years of closure. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was on hand for the ceremony, as were a number of high-ranking Cuban officials. The historic event happened just a day after massive celebrations for the 89th birthday of former Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno also used the opportunity to call for the lifting of the blockade and the closing of the Guantanamo Bay prison.
As part of this stage that begins with the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States, we have agreed on the creation of a sitting committee to define the issues that should be addressed, including those which have remained pending for the last 5 decades. In the coming weeks, representatives of both governments should hold the first exchanges in order to define the agenda of this committee. I have reiterated to the Secretary of State that the total lifting of the blockade, or embargo as you say, as well as the return of the territory occupied illegally by the Guantanamo Naval Base and the compensation to our people for human and economic damages and the full respect to the sovereignty of Cuba are essential to be able to develop normal relations with the U.S.
And U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry also said that he was in favor of lifting the blockade on Cuba.
The overall U.S. embargo on trade with Cuba remains in place and can only be lifted by congressional action, a step that we strongly favor.
Cuba remains very concerned over human rights and political issues in the United States, including ongoing racial discrimination, police brutality, the use of torture, military intervention in other countries, and the undue influence of private and special interests in politics. And Bruno highlighted Cubans' own gains in human rights.
I want to emphasize that Cuba is very proud of its enforcement of the guarantee of the clear exercise of human rights, indivisible, interdependent, universal, civil liberties and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights with equality and conditions for each Cuban woman and man and each citizen.
And Secretary Kerry even dared to say a few words in Spanish, offering his best wishes to Cuba.
And we are certain that the time is now to reach out to one another as two peoples who are no longer enemies or rivals, but neighbors. Time to unfurl our flags, raise them up, and let the world know that we wish each other well.
Cubans are reacting to the embassy reopening in different ways. Hundreds gathered in Havana to celebrate the restoration of diplomatic ties after the U.S. flag was hoisted at the U.S. Embassy for the first time in 54 years.
Delegation
in Miami, Cuban exiles protested the move. The protest became heated as dozens of Cuban protesters began hurling insults and items at those who celebrated the new era of diplomatic relations between the two countries. One protester was even arrested. And our correspondent and also anchor here on From the South, Ray Gomez, is in Havana with the latest.
The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry visited Havana this Friday. He presided over the official reopening of the U.S. Embassy to Cuba. Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs Bruno met his counterpart. They addressed aspects of bilateral interest, including the steps that both countries should take to move towards the normalization of relations. They both agreed on the creation of a bilateral commission to define the topics that should be addressed during the stage that initiates after the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Rodriguez agreed on the importance of consolidating the already existing mechanisms of bilateral cooperation and expand them to include new areas such as environmental protection, healthcare, science, and law enforcement. Cuban Foreign Minister reiterated to the U.S. Secretary of State that the total lifting of the blockade is essential so that both countries could have normal relations, as well as the return of the territory legally occupied by the Guantanamo Naval Base, the compensation to the Cuban people for human and economic damages, and full respect for the sovereignty of Cuba. He emphasized that President Barack Obama is vested with executive powers that enable him to continue adopting measures to modify the implementation of the blockade and contribute to its dismantling. Furthermore, Foreign Minister Rodriguez reiterated to Secretary Kerry the Cuban government's willingness to work for the normalization of relations on the basis of respect and equality without any interference in Cuba's internal affairs. Ray Gomez, teleSUR, Havana, Cuba.